falling out of the nest. As once the young are big enough that they're walking around and they're not tripping over themselves, the adults stop bringing in sticks so that by the end of the season, the nests tend to be really flat. Um, there's no depression, no cup at all in the middle of the nest. It's just like the whole top of the nest is very flat. And occasionally young do fall out of the nest. That happens pretty rarely. The survival instincts are pretty strong, so they tend not to wander too close to the edge until they're capable of using their wings a little bit to help them get back into the middle of the nest. Next question. Assuming the osprey come back to where they were born, do they inbreed? Just covered that pretty much. Females tend to wander, so that reduces the inbreeding chance. But if you're looking at the general area, I'm sure there's some, probably in the denser colonies, there may be a bit of fairly close relative inbreeding going on, but probably not too often. When do the chicks start to feed themselves from fish brought to the nest? Um, if they have their choice, they'll wait for mom to feed them. I've seen fully grown young that have been flighted, in other words, have fledged, have come back to the nest and sat on the nest and begged for their mother to feed them, even though they were perfectly capable of tearing up fish on their own. So they do get sort of spoiled. But by the time they're probably 6 weeks old, 5 to 6 weeks old, they'll be able to tear off bits of food. If mom isn't feeding them and they're hungry, they'll grab something and tear it if there's a bit of food left in the nest. The osprey population seems to be healthy and growing. Will this cause increased conflict over nesting sites? Since natural nesting sites seem fewer than in the past, should people be encouraged to build nesting platforms for ospreys to adopt? Wow, that's a question. I could talk for probably about 45 minutes about that. I won't. But yes, ospreys population is very healthy and growing. It's growing almost everywhere across the country in the lower 48 states. There are now only 2 states where ospreys don't nest, and I think they're Iowa and maybe Kansas, sort of the states you would expect not to have ospreys nesting in. And nesting sites, and ospreys have completely adopted the man-made nesting sites as their preferred nesting situation. They tend to be safer than nesting in trees because we often put predator guards on them. They're less likely to blow over. Sometimes nests built in trees are somewhat precarious, and they can get blown out of trees in wild storms. So it's a good idea to put up nesting platforms if you're in a situation where, like, ospreys are nesting. Again, sometimes it's a mystery why an osprey will or will not use a nest platform that looks to be in a perfect situation. Are the babies safe from other prey when left alone on the nest? I don't recall Rachel leaving the nest last year once the chicks were born. I think that should have been, are they safe from other predators? Not always. Great horned owls are always a threat to ospreys. There was an osprey nest with a cam in Maryland, I think last year, where a great horned owl came in at dusk on 2 nights and snatched 2 young out of the nest. And for some reason didn't come back and get the third, and the third young was successfully fledged. From your experience, do you have any tips for confirming the identity of an adult unbanded osprey from year to year? Do the markings on the back of the head and spots on the legs remain stable from year to year? Certainly the spots on the legs do. That won't change. I don't really have enough experience watching the same individual on a nest cam to see how much the head patterns change, but I think they're fairly consistent from year to year. One useful way to tell is behavior. I know a lot of people have told me at a nest that they, when I arrived one spring to check on the nest, that someone would tell me, "Oh, this is a new male this year." I said, "Why do you know that?" They said, "Well, the old male, every time he brought a fish to the nest, would deliver the fish and go sit on that pole. And the male this year brings the fish in and stays at the nest." So there are some behavioral cues you can use to tell, even without looking at the birds really closely. Um, so that's something that, that's the best I can answer that question. Viewers at Hog Island nests and other osprey nests worldwide have noticed an increase of so-called intruder ospreys this season over earlier nesting season. Have you noticed anything similar in the ospreys you study? How would you explain this behavior, decrease in nesting habitat, increase in success rate of offspring return? I think it's simply a factor of how successful the birds have been, and so the population is growing, and we see every year you'll often see birds trying to insert themselves into established breeding pairs. When we were tagging down in the upper Chesapeake Bay this spring, we were trying to trap and satellite tag an adult male osprey on Kent Island, just across the bay from Annapolis. And we wound up catching a young female who was being a pest and trying to insert herself in that breeding situation. And instead of getting into the nesting pair, she got a transmitter. If you go to my website and look, her name is Crabby, and it's very interesting to watch her behavior as she's flying around and trying to figure out a place where she can fit in and get herself established at a breeding pair. So maybe we'll see that next year. Do ospreys drink water or just get it from what they eat? Mostly they get it from what they eat. Certainly the birds in saltwater wouldn't be drinking salt water, but ospreys around freshwater would drink if they're down taking a bath. But often fish, as everyone knows, are really moist, so they don't need to drink any water. And that's pretty obvious when you think about the juveniles, because the juveniles have no chance to drink the whole 8 weeks or so while they're developing in the nest. So they get all the moisture they need from what they eat. Since the Hog Island osprey offspring will not be DNA tested, how can we distinguish their sex for certain? We must rely on behavior, plumage, and size as we watch them develop and mature. Correct? Yes. Is it accurate to claim that all first hatch osprey chicks are definitely female and that all last hatch osprey chicks are definitely male? That's certainly not the case. There's probably a pretty close to 50-50 chance on each young. Although I've recently read some research that says that there can be a bias in first hatched osprey chicks. There's really no way to tell for intermediate sized birds. Sometimes you can tell females are larger than males, so if you have a real monster young in the nest, you can be sure that's a female. If you have a real small one, it's almost certainly a male. But there are some birds that are sort of middle of the road size-wise that you just can't tell. Could you relate some of the major distinctions between instinctive behaviors and learned behaviors that you had pointed out last season? Are there any new developments in this regard in osprey research since last season? The only thing I would talk about here would be the migration behavior. I've tagged a lot of 45 juvenile ospreys now, satellite tag, and we can tell that their behavior, their migratory behavior is it's clearly instinctive, because young ospreys do not follow their parents on migration. They're on their own. When they decide to head south, they're doing it simply based on instinct. And the instinct isn't very finely tuned. It basically just tells them to go south and stay over land if at all possible. If you can't stay over land, then just go south. And that leads a lot of our Martha's Vineyard birds, for instance, to wind up going down out over the Atlantic Ocean from Martha's Vineyard over open Atlantic Ocean for as many as 50 hours of nonstop flight, arriving in the Bahamas 1,000 miles after crossing 1,000 miles of open water. On their next trip north, they begin to discover, almost by accident, that they didn't have to do that. They get back when they leave South America. They get to Hispaniola, they get to Haiti or Cuba, and they either follow Cuba up towards Florida or they go across the Bahamas, and then they get to the coast of the U.S. and follow that back up to New England. And then, so at that point, they've learned that there is a way that you can get south without doing 1,000 miles over open water. And so on the next trip south, and then the second trip north, each time you can see them sort of fine-tuning and learning the safest migratory route, which for ospreys is staying over land as long as possible. It's not the shortest route. The shortest route is the one that often the juvenile ospreys from Martha's Vineyard take, which is due south over 1,000 miles of open water. But because ospreys can't land in the water and rest like a gull or a duck could, if they get into bad weather out over open water, it can be fatal for them. We've read in Osprey Tracks that last season you tagged your largest number of ospreys yet. How many ospreys are you planning and hoping to tag this season? Last year I tagged 19, I think, and this year I will probably wind up tagging 9 or 10. I'm definitely phasing out. I've tagged so many ospreys that we're not learning much new by tagging additional ospreys. So far this year I've tagged 2 adults down on the Chesapeake Bay, 1 adult male named Chester, and Crabby, the young female who's not yet paired up. And then, just a couple of weeks ago, or beginning of the month, I tagged 3 adult males at the mouth of the Connecticut River, and we were unsuccessful in New Hampshire. And then I've got probably do 4 juveniles this year, so it'll be about 9 birds, I think, this year. The average lifespan of an osprey, we did that question before. Probably, if you included all the young that have hatched, it's probably less than 10 years old, but or probably 6 or 7. But if you take the ones that have made it through the first migration cycle, which is when there's a lot of mortality, I would guess the average lifespan is probably 10 or 12 years old. A lot of birds feed their young regurgitated food, but these ospreys are directly feeding from the fish. Do ospreys have better digestive systems, or is it just that fish are more easily digested than other prey, like squirrels or rabbits? Almost no, I don't know of any raptors that feed their young regurgitated food. Birds that do feed regurgitated food are usually the ones that can't carry food back to the nest. Raptors with their talons can bring prey back to the nest and then just tear it up and feed the young in the nest. Can a male osprey mate and take care of 2 nests in one season? This does happen occasionally. It's not very often, but there are some cases that have been registered, so it does happen. Down in South Carolina a few years ago, we had a case where there were 2 male ospreys taking care of 1 female, which I've never heard of before, but both males were feeding 1 female, and they would both go off and defend the nest. If an eagle came down the Catawba River or a vulture got too close, both males would go out and chase it away. So that was a very interesting observation that I hadn't heard about before. We have a nest here at Colville's Beach in Centerville, Cape Cod, being threatened by either red-tailed hawks or turkey vultures. Do you know about this nest? Is this unusual? I don't know about that nest. Cape Cod, for those who don't know, is the new hotspot of osprey population growth in, at least in southern New England. The population is just exploding there. It seems to be pretty stable elsewhere in southern New England, but it's really growing well in Cape Cod. Turkey vultures certainly wouldn't threaten and neither red tails or turkey vultures would threaten the nest. They would just be flying close to the nest, and the ospreys would just be chasing them away because they don't like anything flying close to their nest, including other ospreys. So that's not really unusual. I've seen a pair of Canada geese take over an osprey's nest on the Columbia River in Washington State, to the point that the male osprey returning to the nest was unable to recover the nest. Is this unusual? Not really. I know it happens every year. I hear of a couple of nests like this, and people will often go up to those nests and put some kind of a deterrent on the nest to keep the Canada geese off the nest platform until the ospreys get back. Canada geese are way bigger than an osprey, so osprey wouldn't be able to displace a Canada goose that had got established at a nest. There was a nest on a bridge. There was a pair of peregrine falcons trying to nest on the South Capitol Street Bridge over the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C., where we tagged a couple of young of ospreys last year. And the Canada geese decided to nest on the same bridge piling that the peregrines were nesting on, so the peregrines didn't get to nest there. What might you see an osprey eat if fish are not available for whatever reason? Almost nothing. It's 99.9% fish in the osprey diet. There are a couple of records of them bringing in a snake, a muskrat, a baby alligator. So those are all things that they caught in the water that are probably fish anyway. There is a good record of an osprey feeding on carrion roadkill, so I know it does happen. And someone was at a hawk banding station at Cape May and had a pigeon as a lure, and an osprey came in to catch the pigeon. So occasionally they will eat other stuff, but it's extremely rare. Last year, the female chick was a bully, and the male chick had to play dead to get her to leave him alone. Is this playing dead typical osprey behavior? Could you explain the purpose of this dominance fighting? Could they really hurt each other? Yeah, that does happen, and the dominance fighting is all about the young do establish a hierarchy. It's part established just by hatching order, so the first hatch tend to be a little bigger than the second or third hatch. And again, that is an insurance policy in case there is a shortage of fish coming into the nest. One bird, the biggest and strongest bird, and the one who has bullied its nestmates into submission, will get first dibs at all the food coming into the nest. So, and that makes sense. It seems cruel, but nature isn't kind. And what happens there, of course, is that if it's a really bad year and there 3 young are hatched, and there's only enough food for one to raise 1 young, if they didn't have that dominance hierarchy established, then all 3 young would equally divide just enough food to feed 1, which would mean that all 3 would die. But because they've set up this dominance hierarchy, 1 young will monopolize all the food coming in, and it will fledge while the others don't. And that is a much better scenario for the adult ospreys to fledge 1 than to fledge none. Are osprey nest locations across the U.S. closely tracked? If someone notices a nest location, is there a place to check to see if this location is recorded, or whom do they notify of location otherwise? For example, the one I saw was on a cell phone tower. Is this a dangerous location? Lots of questions there. There's a great program established by Brian Watts and his group down at College of William and Mary in the Chesapeake Bay. It's called Project Osprey Watch. It's a citizen science project. They have, last I checked, they had 1,700 nests that people were monitoring. So if you see a nest, it's very easy. Just Google Project Osprey Watch on the web, and you'll find their site, and you can register the nest that you discovered, and watch that and provide information for the site. It's really useful information. So everybody that's watching an osprey nest, I strongly encourage them to participate in Project Osprey Watch. As for the danger on the cell phone tower, not really. That's, in fact, I think ospreys think that cell phone towers are just osprey platforms that they let us put telecommunications equipment on. So definitely not dangerous for the ospreys. Sometimes the cell phone people don't like them too much. Nothing like the danger, of course, that ospreys encounter when they're nesting on a power transformer. Ospreys don't need to branch like eagles. They just fledge without going through the branching process. For nests over the water, the chicks often drown if they're not quite ready to fly. I think that behavior is the fact that they don't branch like eagles. And branching, for those who don't know, is when young raptors leave the nest before they're really able to fly very well, and they'll hop from leave the nest proper and hop from branch to branch. I suspect that if ospreys were nesting in trees like eagles do, they might tend to do that. But ospreys typically nest in a very isolated tree, often with very few branches. So I think as a rule, it's just not an option for ospreys. Do they often drown if they're not quite ready to fly? Very rarely. They don't leave the nest until they're good and ready. And often, when they do leave the nest, they're fully capable of flying. Unless something scares them out of the nest, typically they don't leave before they're ready to fly. The tricky part is not flying, it's landing. So ospreys don't have to learn, they really don't learn how to fly. I've seen lots of first flights by young ospreys, and when they leave the nest, it looks like they've been doing it forever, but then when you see them actually try to land for the first time, you realize, oh, that's the hard part. How fast can an osprey fly when they migrate? Typically, they fly about 20 to 25 miles an hour, but we had Belle last year left Martha's Vineyard with a wicked tailwind out of the north, and she got to Cuba in less than 2 days. I think she was going, at some points during that trip, she was going over 40 miles an hour, which is rocket speed for an osprey. How would you say the chicks in this nest are doing so far this year? They look great. Haven't watched them a lot, but they look good from what I've seen. Is 50 hours of continuous flight about the limit for an osprey? We don't know. I think I've had one go longer than 50. And it's very rare for them to do that because it's only the juveniles and only, as far as I know, only juveniles from Martha's Vineyard and maybe Cape Cod or Nantucket would do that. Virtually all of the other ospreys go over land all the way to Florida, and then they hop over to Cuba, then to Hispaniola. And so they're only really, the long flight for almost all eastern and midwestern ospreys is going from the Dominican Republic or Haiti to South America. And that's 400 to 500 miles. So that typically would be, they go 25 miles an hour. So that's something like a 20 to maybe a 30-hour flight. So they could probably go longer than that, but it's hard to say. And they can't feed themselves when they're out over the water like that. So it's a pretty long haul to go without resting. But we know they can do that. There are differences in behavior, appearance, or anything between East and West Coast ospreys. Nothing appearance-wise, but the behavior. The West Coast ospreys tend to only migrate to Mexico or Central America. Very few of them go on through to South America. All the eastern ospreys, almost all of them, go to South America, probably 90 to 95% go to South America. The Midwestern birds, some go to the East Coast and go down the Florida-Cuba route, some go down through Mexico, but most of the Midwestern birds will go to South America as well. We saw a lot of insects earlier in the season attacking Rachel to the point that she was bleeding from her nares. her nostrils. Could biting insects and mites cause serious injury to the adults or chicks? I presume, I don't know. They might weaken young. They could um, draw enough blood, I suppose, to weaken young. I don't think anyone has any good information on that. How densely will ospreys populate an area? Is there an average territory size? Ospreys really don't have territories as a rule because when they feed, they're going off far from the nest, often 10 to 15 miles away from their nest, and so there's no way that ospreys can defend a territory. They can defend the immediate vicinity around their nest, and that's, I guess one could call that a territory. So typically, it's hard to say what the density would be. The densest osprey population that was ever recorded was on Gardiner's Island, which is a small island of only about 6 square miles at the eastern tip of Long Island. It's in between the two north and south forks of eastern Long Island. And on that island, there were 300 pairs of ospreys in 6 square miles, and there's never been a colony recorded anywhere at that density. Nests were as close as 10 yards apart. And that was a colony that was at least 200 years old, because Alexander Wilson, in the first book about ornithology in North America, called American Ornithology, which was published in 1812, Alexander Wilson mentions the 300 pairs of ospreys on Gardiner's Island. So that's something that probably developed over centuries, and the birds just became more and more accustomed to nesting in very close proximity. And I think there's probably a bit of almost a cultural thing there, where the young coming back to nest on Gardiner's Island were used to growing up in a very crowded colony, and so that was normal to them. It's very rare. There's nowhere else where ospreys are anywhere near that dense and achieve that near that dense a population. Are there any studies insofar as identifying osprey by some of the small black markings within the iris of the birds? Extreme zoom capabilities of some cameras being used are instrumental in revealing impressive detail. I don't know if anyone's done any. I have not read anything about that, so it certainly could be the case that would work. Sort of an iris scan, if you would. Can mature and immature ospreys safely eat fish bones? Yes, they do. They tend not to avoid the real big ones, but they will always wind up eating some bones, and that's not an issue for them. Have osprey nests ever been struck by lightning? What about an osprey getting struck during flight? I don't know if it could get struck during flight, but I know nests do get struck by lightning. I know of 2 nests on Martha's Vineyard that were struck by lightning, or 3 actually. And one of them, the telephone pole, was pretty much reduced to big toothpicks. It was pretty remarkable. I know there was one nest that was struck by lightning where the nest didn't fall over and the young survived, and the young fledged out of that nest after a lightning strike. Can there be 2 chicks and 1 egg? No. I don't believe so. Well, then maybe I guess that is possible. Yeah, because I've seen double yolked eggs. So, in theory, that they could start out that way, but developmentally they wouldn't survive. So I've seen 2 yolked eggs, so that I know happens. But it's the young certainly 2 young couldn't develop in 1 egg. We know that some Florida ospreys don't migrate. Do you know whether any of them migrate? Yes. A fair number of ospreys in Florida nest. I think mostly the birds way south in Florida that don't. Always been a great mystery to me why any osprey that lived in Florida would migrate, but a fair number do. And that really results in 2 separate waves of breeding down in Florida. So the non-migrants get started way before the migrants. So there's sort of 2 waves of reproduction. The migrants getting started a fair bit later than the non-migrants. Why are the chicks hobbling around the nest using their feet to support themselves? How quickly will they be able to stand up without the extra help from their wings? They just haven't developed the skeletal and muscular um, condition to be able to stand up, and they should be standing up fairly soon, I think. A lot of you who watch this nest all the time and watched it over the past years would be able to answer that question better than I. Welcome back, Dr. Rob. Thank you. How developed is the auditory sense in our osprey? Pretty good. They do use, they communicate with each other, between each other with vocalization, so clearly they have some hearing, but it's certainly nothing like um, the ability that owls have, for instance, because they don't use sound to catch their prey. So it wouldn't be something that you would expect to be um, as highly evolved and acutely sensitive as their sight. What is the purpose of that extra film over the eye? That's called a nictitating membrane. That's your fancy word for the day. And it's sort of like a windshield wiper. Keeps the eye moist, and it probably flips over as they're going into the water. Um, and when they're flying, it's a little windshield wiper, basically. Can osprey drink salt water to survive? They really don't need to, because the food they eat, the fish they eat, are so moist that they don't need any extra water. How do osprey know how to navigate when they migrate? Another question I can talk to you all for about 2 hours about, but I won't. Um, so they use a number of techniques, and this is true not just of ospreys but all birds. Um, and there's a quite difference between navigation and orientation. So when they're going south on the first time, and I would argue that they're not really navigating, because I think that navigation entails having a destination in mind and knowing if you're off track, how to correct for that. So I think the young birds are not really navigating in a strict sense. So they're using a number of senses. They will certainly use landmarks. So if they're flying around home and as they wander around their natal territory, they'll remember landmarks. And so all birds will use landmarks when they can. But birds that are going south and get blown off course don't use landmarks. The adults obviously don't use landmarks because when they migrate south each year, they'll often take very different routes to get to the same place. So they use the sun to tell them what the direction, which way north and south is. They use the Earth's magnetic field, again, to tell them where north and south is. And there's some other sense they have that helps them distinguish between east and west. And that's the real mystery of any bird migration. How do birds know that they've been displaced east or west of their nest? Beginning to get some really interesting, intriguing results about that birds have two ways to sense the Earth's magnetic field, one through their eyes and one through their some magnetite crystals in their lower beak, in fact, which is just amazing. They also use the stars at night to tell which way north and south is. So it's all probably the most fascinating part of avian biology is how do migrants find their way to their nest sites in the spring and to their wintering grounds in the fall. Remember, these ospreys are flying. Some of them are flying 4,000 or 5,000 miles, and they're finding the exact same little tributary of the Amazon every year, even though they get there by very different routes. We've had the same male arrive hit South America 400 miles east or west of where it hit the year before, and they can correct for that and find their way to their same little favorite wintering spot. Is it normal behavior for a chick to sleep while food is being offered? Sure, especially the young ospreys as young as the chicks in this nest. If they've just holding their head up for a while is a real struggle, and if they've been begging for food and sort of struggling with their nest mates to get food, that might tucker them out, and they could sleep for a bit. And especially if they've been fed and they've had all they want to eat, um, definitely not unusual for them to sleep while the rest of the young are getting some food. Probably that won't last for much longer than a bit longer than the age of these young now. Since the female are larger than males, does this mean that Rachel was probably the dominant chick in her nest when she was small? Not necessarily. She could have been the third hatched. And so it's easy to imagine a scenario where she was the last hatched, and she might, if the first hatch was a female and she was the last hatched, she could have definitely been the third, the low bird on the totem pole. Um, so that could certainly happen. We are mystified by osprey's attraction to birch bark. Steve and Rachel brought it in last year and again this year. What are your thoughts? Oh, they love to trim their nests with all sorts of weird things. My favorite, I think, is a bikini top that someone found in an osprey nest one time. They bring in all sorts of junk, and often it's seaweed and clumps of grass. I think sometimes when people think ospreys are hunting for mice, they're actually doing is just bringing clumps of grass to trim up the nest. And they do that early on as an insulation, because remember, these nests are sitting up totally exposed to the weather, and ospreys in New England can get hit by a nor'easter in the spring, and you could have a 40-degree or less night with howling winds, and the females trying to keep those eggs warm. And so insulation in the bottom of the nest is really important, and they just don't seem to be very picky about what they bring into the nest. How vulnerable are ospreys to climate change? Is there any evidence that populations are shifting as a result of the commercial fishing industry overfishing? Two very different questions there. I don't think they're terribly vulnerable to climate change. They're very flexible in the fish that they feed on. They have their favorite types, but when the favorite types aren't around, they'll switch to others. Is there any evidence that populations are shifting as a result of the commercial fishing industry overfishing? Definitely. Well, not shifting as much as not doing quite as well. The big commercial fishing industry, a couple of species of fish come to mind here. The most important is menhaden, which are often called bunker or pogie. This is a fish that we have seriously overfished, and it's a remarkable fish. There's a great book written by H. Bruce Franklin called The Most Important Fish in the Sea, and I highly recommend anybody who's interested in ospreys read that book. The menhaden were once unbelievably abundant. There were schools of menhaden that were 40 miles long, migrating up the coast, east coast of the United States every spring. And that osprey colony on Gardiner's Island that had 300 pairs were almost entirely dependent on menhaden. There were so many menhaden in Gardiner's Bay that there were 20 menhaden factories that were used to render menhaden into fish meal and oil. The populations now are maybe a tenth of what they used to be, and that may explain why the Gardiner's Island population hasn't recovered to anywhere near what it was before DDT wiped them back. Another big difference we've seen in southern New England in terms of what fish are brought in are flounder. Flounder often were Martha's Vineyard back in the 70s. There were flounder was probably the most common fish you saw ospreys bringing into the nest. Once the Georges banks were shut down for commercial fishing, a lot of the fishing fleet shifted inland and started bottom trawling for flounder, and they really knocked back the winter flounder population, so that now it's rare for an osprey to be seen with a flounder. But they've been able to shift to other other food types. Striped bass or bluefish can take the place of the flounder. Um, so big changes in those two species as a result of commercial overharvesting of those fish species. Why don't they mate in South America? Why come all the way north? Great question, and it probably has to do with the availability of fish down in South America. The rivers down there tend to be either um, blackwater rivers, which are full of tannic acids, and it looks like really almost flat Coca-Cola. It's so dark, and it's hard to see into them. So, and then most of the other rivers in the Amazon tend to be whitewater rivers, and when they talk about whitewater rivers in South America, it's not whitewaters as in rapids, it's whitewaters as in they're full of clay particles, so they're sort of looks like coffee with cream. So ospreys, it's hard to see into those waters, and so it's hard for an osprey to catch a whole lot of fish there. Easy for an osprey to catch enough fish to feed itself, but you have to remember that once the breeding season is, once the pairs are formed, and the female is sitting on eggs, the male has to catch all the food for himself, for the female, and then for 1, 2, 3, or even 4 young. So there's a huge pressure put on the males in the breeding season, and it's unlikely that down there a male would be able to catch enough fish to feed a whole family. Whereas back up in New England, especially in the spring, there's this huge flush of fish. The menhaden are particularly abundant and important, and the flounder. So there's a vast resource of fish that are abundantly available in the spring, and so it's this huge flush of resources that where it's easy for an osprey to come in and catch enough fish to feed a family. Do they really talk? How complex is their vocal communication? I can't answer that question. They certainly, the conversations that go on are basically when they're courting, it's I'm a male. If you're a female, let's talk about breeding. If you're another male, I'm claiming this territory. They complain when an intruder is coming near their nest, and they talk to each other effectively about food. So if the female is young, or the young, when the young are hungry, or the female is hungry, she'll give a hunger call that tells the male it's time to go out to feed. And there's probably not much other than that goes on vocally. What percentage of hunting attacks are successful? Varies with the varies with the fish species and also weather conditions. It can be as high as 30 or 40% successful attacks. Can be lower than that. Ospreys like a little bit of wind because it makes it easy for them to hover when they've seen if they're hunting or flying around looking for fish. If they see fish, you'll see them. They'll circle back and hover, and the hovering is much easier if there's a little bit of a breeze. If there's too much breeze, then whitecaps develop on the water, and then it makes it really hard or impossible for the ospreys to see the fish through the chop. What would cause eggs laid by a well-established pair not to hatch? Good question. Maybe it could be age, maybe some reproductive hitch in fertilization. It might be that an egg somehow got separated from the others and it got chilled. It might be, sometimes I've seen eggs cracked by the adults. Nowadays that doesn't happen much, but it can happen. It happened a lot back in the DDT era when eggshells were thinned because of DDT. At what age will they stop migrating? Whatever age they die. They'll migrate as long as they're alive. so they don't ever stop migrating. How instinctive is parenting? Do parents go through a learning process to get it right? Clearly, uh, parenting is the most basic instinct there is, but new parents definitely go through a learning process. So we often will see birds in their first year um, do what we call them housekeepers, where they'll build a nest and um, uh, it may take them a year or two to get it right. And so there is some learning that goes on in that whole process. How many years do osprey continue to have offspring that live and thrive? There's the one famous female in Scotland who is 27 years old and has fledged 50 young, so that's the real outlier in the curve. Um, Typically, as they get to their mid-teens, the reproductive success tends to go down a little bit. At what age do they usually become infertile? Is this the same for male and female? Or if a female does not have viable eggs, does the male go to find another female to mate with? Let's see. Again, the fertility, I'm not sure about fertility, but their reproductive success tends to drop off in their mid to late teens. Don't know about males and females. That 27-year-old female in Scotland has been through 6 or 7 males. So again, the males are doing all the hunting for the family, so there's a lot more stress on males than females. Um, Female does not have viable eggs. Does the male go to find another female to mate with? Probably not. That might be a bit more of a rationalization um, than we would expect to see in a male. As long as the male is mated to a female and they both come back, um, I would suspect that uh, they would stick together. Um, While watching another osprey cam, observed the male protecting the incubating female by covering her with his body and wings. I've never seen this form of defensive behavior. How unusual is this? Do they generally defend a nest from the air? In the image, you can see the female's face peeking out. That's unusual. I haven't heard about that. But usually they will go and if there's an intruder, they will go and chase it away in the air. Would high winds like hurricane confuse them on their migration? Um, Not really confuse them as much as blow them off course. We had um, one bird named Thatch from Martha's Vineyard who wound up flying 1,000 miles over the Caribbean because he left Cuba, and when he left Cuba, the weather was fairly benign, but unbeknownst to him, a big hurricane I think Hurricane Thomas was coming up the Caribbean, and he flew into it and wound up flying around it, and I don't remember how many hours, but it was 1,000 miles that he survived getting blown around the Caribbean by that storm, which was really amazing. Um, the PBS series Earthflight last fall mentioned that magnetic particles within the anatomy of some bird species help govern migration, in addition to celestial bodies, coastlines, etc. Do you know if this is true of ospreys? What other animals have these sorts of particles? Uh, I don't know if it's true of ospreys. I suspect it is. Hasn't been demonstrated. I believe turtles have been demonstrated to have these magnetite crystals that help them line up the Earth's magnetic field. I am in an area where ospreys migrate through, feed for about a week, and then leave. There are 3 small to medium lakes I have a platform. I just need to attach to pole and install pole into ground. Do you have any suggestions to attract a pair for nesting? The closest pair I know of is about 40 miles away. A couple of things here. If you want to attract ospreys, the best thing to do is to build a nest on the platform. The folks over in Scotland do this all the time. And they don't just put a platform up, but they actually build a complete nest with nest lining, the whole works. And that really works on getting ospreys to use a platform. Because it's 40 miles away from the nearest nest, it's going to be hard to get a pair established because males tend to nest very close to where they were born. So that nest might be attractive to a female, and she might settle down at that nest, but it's unlikely to have a male when it comes back from migration and find that nest. Could happen, but it's a little bit unlikely. Do you know if the Chesapeake Conservancy ospreys are banded, marked, or tagged, Tom and Audrey? No, they're not. We tagged one of their neighbors. This is the Tom and Audrey are birds that nest on Kent Island, which is just across the Bay Bridge from Annapolis on the eastern shore of Maryland. We tagged a bird named Chester, who is the closest neighbor to Tom and Audrey, just on the other side of Cock's Neck. And then we tagged Crabby, a young female who is at another nest nearby. Rachel seems a bit stressed about Steve's whereabouts. Could this be a problem, like something may have happened to him since the last feeding? Don't know. My guess is you're reading too much into that. She may be hungry, and he may be off feeding and unsuccessful in catching a fish for a bit. So she might be stressed because he isn't back in with food, but unlikely that something happened to him in the middle of the day. Bad things happen to ospreys at night, and that's usually because of great horned owls. Is a young osprey that has fledged already in danger from eagles in the area? Perhaps, but probably more great horned owls than eagles. Question number 68. What does the parent do with an unhatched egg or a chick that dies? They tend to ignore it. Sometimes the chicks just sort of disappear down into the nest material. There have been cases, this is a bit gory, but there was a case of an osprey nest that was the Dennis Puliston nest in Long Island, where a young died, and one of the adults flew out of the nest with it and flew around for a while and brought it back and fed it to the other young. So a bit gruesome, but nothing wasted there. If something happens to the adult female osprey and could no longer take care of her chicks, would the adult male osprey take over the feeding and nesting duties while continuing his own hunting duties? I suspect so. It's unlikely to happen, but because females stay so close to the nest and males do almost all the hunting. We had the flip side of that happen in Long Island a couple of years ago, where a male was killed, and this was a bird that we had satellite tagged, and he was killed about a month later. And the female was able to go out and do the single mom thing and actually raise at least one young out of that nest all by herself. What is the average length of sleep in a 24-hour period for ospreys? I have no idea. You folks who watch these nests so often would have a much better answer to that question than I can. My husband, a builder, got permission to take a nest off a chimney in Centerville on Cape Cod. There were sunglasses in there. Do they just put anything in there, really? What unusual things have you seen woven into a nest? Well, I mentioned the bikini top, which is the all-time favorite, of course. They love to put the bait bags from that lobster fishermen use, the nylon bait bags. Those are up there all the time. Plastic bags, fishing line, and that's a real danger because ospreys will often get strangled, get tied up in fishing line that's brought into the nest. So all of you fisher people out there, to make sure that you dispose of your spent fishing line appropriately. Um, uh, Plastic um, shovels that kids use on the beach, bits of rope. They seem like colored rope. Um, all sorts of weird things get brought into the nest. Do ospreys generally soar on thermals the way that vultures do? Yeah, definitely going, especially when they're migrating, but also even around the nest. On a warm day or a hot day, they'll go up on soar, and I've seen ospreys go so high up that you can barely see them with binoculars. And when we're looking at the migration of our birds that are tagged with the cell phone tower transmitters, where we often get data every minute, we can actually see when they're going up on thermals. So they use them a lot on migration. How can we tell if Steve is bringing enough fish for the whole family? What signs are there that the third chick is not thriving? It would get weak. It would, if the other young would start to peck at it more, probably. If things were, if they were feeling hungry a lot, they would become more aggressive toward that third young, and you would see it not growing as fast as the others. That can happen. Why did I decide to specialize in osprey studies? What is your favorite part about your job? Um, so I decided to specialize in osprey studies because ospreys are so fascinating and they're so easy to study. There really isn't another raptor that is as amenable to research as ospreys. They nest out in the open. It's hard not to find an osprey nest, and a lot of other birds of prey. Um, it's really hard to find their nests, hard to get to the nests. So ospreys have a lot going for them in that they're so common. They're so easy to census. They're easy to trap. Um, and So they're just a great species to study, and they're so charismatic and exciting to watch. So that's sort of a no-brainer. The favorite part of my job, hard to call it a job really, but what I like most about the research probably is it's just all of the really fascinating things we've learned about their migration using the satellite tracking um, techniques, especially figuring out how the young are migrating and how they learn their migratory routes. That's really been just amazingly fascinating. Can you explain what it is like to hold an adult osprey when you're banding it? Are there particular techniques for holding them? Um, we put a hood on them, which calms them down, and it's like blinders on a horse, although it's a complete blinding. So they get pretty docile once you've got a hood on them. We can sort of hold them in your arms like a sort of like holding a baby in your arm, um, and keep their wings together. We have a little canvas sort of a wrap that goes around them to keep them from struggling. Um, we use that to weigh them, and it keeps them from struggling. That, along with the hood, means they're pretty calm. I've had ospreys fall asleep in my arms while we've been holding on to a female while we waited to catch her mate. Um, so it's fairly straightforward, and never had an osprey injured in the handling process. So fairly straightforward, and the hood is the biggest aid in handling the birds. That really calms them down. Does a mother ever kill one by mistake? Sitting on it too hard, etc. I suspect some eggs have been, that's probably happened. Um, and I've found an egg in a nest that was almost hatched out. You could see that the young had pipped, it had broken its way in, was starting to hatch, and the egg was cracked So I think that might have been an accident in the nest. Sometimes that happens when a third bird comes into the nest with the two adults and there's some struggling. Um, so it can happen, but it's obviously very rare. And I'm sure you've all watched how when the female is going in to sit on, to brood, warm up the young, how she balls her feet up so that the talons are, she basically hides the talons and balls her feet up and goes in so delicately as she goes in to stand on the nest. That's just, I love watching how tender the female is around the young. Do you have a recommendation for a good organization that trains wild bird rehabilitators? Is there a certification process nationally recognized, or is it state by state? Thank you for the evening session. Um, there depends on where you are. If you're in the Carolinas, the Carolina Raptor Center in Charlotte is a fabulous site. I don't know other rehabilitation centers, and I think it's certainly a state-by-state process. That's not something that's nationally registered or moderated, as it were. So we're wrapping up now. That was a great set of questions. Thank you for participating. Um, and I think there are still some spots available for the Rapture Camp on Hog Island. I'm going to be up there between July 13th and 18th. This is an Audubon sort of adult nature camp. I'm going to be there. A colleague of mine named Yossi Lessem, who is an Israeli raptor biologist, he's just an amazing character and a great raptor biologist, is also going to be there, as is Scott Weidensaul. So that's going to be a fabulous week of nothing but raptors on Hog Island. So it's the website is hogisland.audubon.org/raptor-rapture. So I hope to see some of you there. And if some other questions show up on the discus, I will respond to those either now or a little bit later. I'll try to get to any questions that show up on discus. So thanks to all, and maybe we'll do this again a little later in the season when the young are a bit bigger. Bye now.